It is 1944. The sound that dominates the Baltic is no longer that of the sea or the cutting wind. It is the continuous thunder of Soviet artillery advancing mercilessly. The Red Army, strengthened by men, tanks, and a thirst for revenge accumulated over years of war, breaks through the German lines like an unstoppable tide. Villages that yesterday still displayed German flags now burn in flames, with columns of black smoke rising into a heavy grey sky. The roads are crowded with exhausted soldiers, many with torn uniforms, boots soaked with melted snow, and dried blood on their sleeves. There are no more illusions. The officers know, and the soldiers feel it in the pit of their stomachs. The front is not just retreating, it is falling apart. Every kilometer lost means less time, fewer options, fewer lives. The reports arrive in waves of horror, entire units surrounded and destroyed, comrades taken prisoner or worse. For Germans and local collaborators, the message is clear and brutal. To stay is not to resist. To stay is to die. Fear comes not only from the enemy ahead, but from what might happen when he finally catches up with those left behind. The weather makes everything worse. The Baltic winter doesn't forgive mistakes or hesitations. The cold bites the skin like invisible blades, stiffens fingers, jams weapons. Men tremble not only from the cold, but from the certainty that time has run out. Every decision is now made under pressure, with lives hanging by a thread. It is in this scenario of total collapse that the unthinkable idea is born. An escape that is not on the maps, nor in the war manuals. Eyes turn north, to the white and silent horizon of the frozen sea. The Gulf of Finland, solid as stone under the extreme winter, ceases to be just frozen water. It transforms into the last route of survival. The front is collapsing, and with it collapses any hope of an organized retreat. What remains is urgency, fear, and a terrible choice. Confront the advancing enemy, or entrust one's life to the ice. The collapse of the Baltic Front in 1944 did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually. It gradually falls apart, like thin ice under excessive weight. After years of German occupation, the Red Army returns with a force that the front simply cannot absorb. It is not just a military advance, it is a human and mechanical avalanche, pushed by T-34 tanks, heavy artillery and infantry hardened by Stalingrad, Kursk and Leningrad. Soviet offensives in the north, part of the great push that would liberate the Baltic states, break the backbone of Army Group North. Lines that once seemed solid begin to crumble. Communications fail. Orders arrive too late or never at all. In many sectors, German soldiers discover they are isolated only when enemy fire comes from behind them. Coastal cities become traps. Riga, Tallinn, small port towns and back roads fill with retreating columns. There are no more parades, no more confidence. There are only men, walking with their heads down, carrying weapons they can barely hold with their frozen hands. Some still try to maintain discipline, others are already marching on autopilot, driven only by the instinct to survive another day. Fear is palpable. It spreads faster than any official order. Rumors circulate among the ranks. What happens to those captured? What happens to local collaborators? What happens to the wounded who cannot keep up with the retreat? For many, the Soviet advance represents not only military defeat, but the absolute end of any future. The Baltic winter closes in. Snow covers roads, erases landmarks, transforms familiar paths into white labyrinths. Vehicles get stuck, horses fall dead mid-ride, and the bodies lie there, partially covered in ice, like silent warnings of what awaits those who cannot move forward. The cold makes no distinction between experienced soldier and young recruit. It robs strength from everyone equally. Officers attempt to organize temporary defensive lines, but the reality is unforgiving. There is a lack of men, a lack of ammunition, a lack of time. Every position held for a few hours costs too much blood, and everyone knows that no reinforcements are coming. The Reich is retreating on all fronts. The Baltic has been abandoned to its fate. It is at this moment that perception changes. The sea, which for centuries was a natural barrier, is now still, frozen, silent. The Gulf of Finland ceases to be merely an element on the map and becomes a desperate promise, a treacherous white surface that separates life from death. No one truly trusts ice, but trusting the approaching enemy is even more impossible. Thus, as the front crumbles behind them, the minds of soldiers and civilians begin to accept the unthinkable. The war in the Baltic will not be decided in trenches or fortified cities. It will be decided there, where there is no cover, where there is no shelter, where every step could be the last. The front has collapsed, and, with it, any illusion of control has crumbled. What begins now is no longer a military campaign. It is escape for survival, written in ice, under the weight of a relentless winter and an enemy that never stops advancing. The desperate decision, fleeing through the ice. The decision isn't made in a heated room, nor under well-lit maps. It emerges amidst chaos, distant explosions, screams muffled by the wind, and men who haven't slept in days. When the officers finally face reality, they understand that there is no longer a conventional withdrawal. The roads are under Soviet fire, the ports are relentlessly bombarded, and the available ships are neither sufficient nor safe. Paradoxically, escaping by sea becomes impossible. Submarines, naval mines, and Soviet aircraft have transformed the waters of the Baltic into a floating graveyard. Ships attempting to evacuate troops and civilians are hit, burn slowly, or disappear beneath black, icy waves. Each explosion on the horizon confirms the worst. Those who wait for rescue at sea may never get out of there. Then someone looks down. Beyond the frozen boots, a white and silent desert stretches out. The Gulf of Finland is completely frozen. A continuous, hard, seemingly solid field of ice, something that shouldn't be crossed by men, much less armies. There are no trails, no protection, no guarantee whatsoever. Just kilometers of ice between certain death and a minimal chance of survival. The idea sounds absurd at first. Marching across the frozen sea with armed soldiers, wounded, equipment and civilians. Any mistake, any change in temperature, any stronger impact could break the ice and swallow everything. But war offers no comfortable choices. It only offers the least deadly option. Orders begin to circulate in hushed tones, almost like secrets. The plan isn't announced with speeches, it's whispered. Groups are hastily organized. What can't be carried is abandoned. Cannons are left behind, vehicles are sabotaged, documents are burned. What remains must fit on the back of a man already at his limit. Among the soldiers, fear takes on a different form. Before, it came from the visible enemy. Now, it comes from the ground beneath their feet. Many have never walked on ice before. Others have heard stories of men who disappeared in seconds, sucked into the dark water without even having time to scream. Still, no one refuses to go, because everyone knows falling behind isn't courage, it's a death sentence. Civilians are pushed into the evacuation zone. Women hold children wrapped in thin blankets. The elderly walk with short, unsteady steps. There are no priorities, no special security measures. The ice makes no distinction between soldier and civilian. It accepts everyone the same way, or kills them all the same way. When the first columns line up at the edge of the ice, the silence is absolute. Behind them, the sky pulses with the distant glow of Soviet artillery. Ahead, only white, wind, and uncertainty. No marked path, no promise of return. The decision has been made. Not because it's a good one, but because it's the right one. Only possible. The war has pushed these men to the edge of the map, and now demands that they trek beyond it, across a frozen sea, betting everything on an enemy even more cruel than the Red Army, winter itself. Winter as both ally and executioner. The Baltic winter doesn't arrive suddenly. It's already there, dominating everything. Temperatures well below zero transform the air into an invisible blade that cuts the lungs with every breath. The same cold that solidified the Gulf of Finland, making crossing possible, now reveals itself as an enemy as deadly as any army. The ice appears firm at first glance, white, vast, silent. But this solidity is a dangerous illusion. In many places, the frozen layer is uneven, formed by weeks of extreme cold interspersed with brief thaws. Some sections support the weight of dozens of men, others give way under a single, miscalculated step. There's no way to tell the difference until it's too late. Soldiers quickly learn that the cold doesn't kill quickly. It robs energy little by little. First, their fingers lose feeling. Then come their feet, their face, their ears. Men stop feeling their own hands but still need to hold their rifles. Many keep marching with already frozen feet, unaware that they are injuring themselves with every step. When the pain finally appears, the damage is already irreversible. The wind is constant. It sweeps across the ice without hindrance, pierces through clothing, seeps under coats, finds any flaw in the fabric. There are no trees, no hills, no houses, only men exposed in a white desert. At night, the wind chill drops even further, and the cold becomes almost alive, a presence that envelops everything. Paradoxically, winter also offers protection. The ice prevents Soviet tanks from advancing directly. The open surface makes ground ambushes difficult. For a few moments, it seems the cold is on the side of those fleeing. But this protection comes at a high price. Every hour exposed to the ice is a game of Russian roulette. Every long stop could mean death from hypothermia. Some soldiers try to sleep during brief breaks. Many don't wake up. Others wake up confused, their minds sluggish, not recognizing where they are. The cold affects the body, but also the mind. Wrong decisions become more common. Men stray from the columns and disappear into the infinite white, swallowed by the silence. The water beneath the ice is absolute terror, black, icy, deadly in seconds. Those who fall in rarely manage to get out. The thermal shock paralyzes the muscles, breath disappears, and the weight of the equipment pulls the body down. Those watching cannot help. Stopping means dying too. Thus, winter takes on two faces. It is both the path and the trap, the makeshift bridge and the invisible executioner. While the enemy advances behind them, the cold advances from within. And each man begins to understand a cruel truth. It's not enough to escape the Red Army. You have to survive the winter itself. The march continues, not because there is hope, but because stopping is not an option. The ice stretches ahead, endless, and winter watches, patient, claiming its share in blood and silence. Preparations, under constant terror. There is no time for careful planning. Everything is done hastily, under the distant, and sometimes all too close, echo of Soviet artillery. Orders arrive fragmented, often contradictory. Officers try to impose some logic on the chaos, but the truth is harsh. No one is truly prepared to cross a frozen sea. Preparations begin with cruel choices. What to take, what to leave behind. Every extra pound can be the difference between crossing a fragile stretch of ice or sinking into it. Cannons are destroyed on the spot, trucks set on fire, ammunition buried in the snow. Equipment that took months to transport is now left behind in minutes. War reduces everything to the essentials. A weapon, a few bullets, some food and leg strength. The wounded are the biggest dilemma. There aren't enough vehicles nor adequate sleds. Many are placed in makeshift structures made with torn-off doors, pieces of wood and ripped tarpaulins. Others simply receive a silent look, a mute apology, and are left behind. Not out of cruelty, but because the mathematics of survival is unforgiving. The terror is constant. Soviet planes appear on the horizon, small, black dots against the grey sky. When they descend, the entire ice seems to tremble. Explosions raise columns of ice and snow, scattering shards as sharp as blades. Each attack forces the column to disperse, breaking any formation. Then, everything needs to be reorganized again with fewer men than before. Food is scarce. Frozen rations have to be broken open with the butt of a rifle. Water is non-existent, only snow melted in the mouth, stealing even more heat from the body. The exhaustion is so profound that some men begin to make simple mistakes. They drop weapons, stumble, forget orders given minutes before. Among civilians, panic is growing. Mothers clutch their children to their chests, trying to protect them from the wind. Elderly people walk with short steps, breathing heavily. There are no hysterical screams. The fear here is silent, heavy, resigned. Everyone knows that the first step on the ice is also a step into the unknown. When the moment finally arrives to move forward, one makes speeches. There are no words of courage, just exchanged glances, a few quick signals, and the muffled sound of hundreds of boots touching the ice for the first time. A hollow, strange sound that echoes underfoot, as if the sea itself were warning that it will not forgive mistakes. The preparations end there, not because they are ready, but because there's nothing more to be done. Behind them, war approaches. Ahead, the ice awaits, and in the middle, men and women carry all that remains to them, the weight of their bodies, the weight of fear, and the fragile hope of reaching the other side alive. The first footprints in white hell. The first step on the ice is taken hesitantly. The boot touches the frozen surface, and a dry sound echoes too deep to ignore. It's not like stepping on solid ground. It's like walking on something alive, responding to every movement. Some men stop for a moment, hold their breath, hoping the ice will break right there. It doesn't, yet. The column begins to advance slowly, spread out, keeping distance between the men so as not to concentrate too much weight on a single point. The rhythm is strange. Irregular. There are no marches, no military cadence. Each one walks as best he can, looking at his feet, attentive to any crack, any change in the tone of the ice under the fine snow. The silence is unsettling. There are no creaking trees, no cities, no trenches, only wind and the muffled sound of footsteps. This silence makes everything worse. Each blow from below sounds like a sentence. The ice groans, cracks, responds to the human presence. It's impossible to ignore. Within the first few kilometers, the first accidents occur. A man steps onto a darker area where the ice is thinner. He disappears up to his waist in a second. Others try to pull him out, but the surrounding ice begins to give way. Short, desperate cries. Black water surges forth, steaming with cold. In less than a minute, it's all over. Where a man once stood, only an irregular hole in the ice remains, and no one dares to approach. The march continues. There is no time to stop nor to lament. Each delay increases the risk of air raids or further weakening of the ice. Men dodge holes, circumvent crevasses, learn to recognize dangerous areas by color and sound. Fear turns into rapid learning. The wind picks up as they move toward the middle of the Gulf. It lashes head-on, pushes, throws them off balance. Snowflakes cut their faces like needles. Visibility plummets. At times, it's impossible to see the end of the column or what lies ahead. The world shrinks to a few meters of ice and the silhouette of the man in front. The cold begins to take its toll far too soon. Hardened hands drop weapons. Frozen boots hurt their feet with every step. Some soldiers are already limping, but they keep going. To stop means to freeze to death. To fall means to drown. As the footprints multiply, the ice seems to protest. Tiny cracks appear and spread like veins. Beneath the white surface, each one provokes immediate tension. The silent order is clear. Don't run, don't crowd together, don't panic. The first footprints are in. There is no turning back. Behind them, the coast disappears into the distant mist and smoke of war. Ahead, only more ice, a path that leads neither to victory nor to glory, only to possibility of surviving another day. Soviet artillery and aviation enter the scene. The illusion that the ice would offer anonymity is short-lived. Soon, the sky begins to betray the enemy's presence. First, a distant hum, almost indistinguishable from the wind. Then, dark spots emerge among the low clouds. Soviet planes. They don't need to see trenches or organized columns. The mass of people on the ice is too visible. When the first bombs fall, all hell breaks loose. Explosions launch not only fire and metal, but entire blocks of ice into the air. The impact reverberates for miles, making the ground tremble beneath one's feet. Where the bomb hits, the ice breaks in jagged circles, creating craters that immediately fill with black water. Men are hurled like mannequins. Some fall dead, others fall alive. Straight into the icy sea. There is nowhere to hide. In the ice, there are no holes, no walls, no trees. The soldiers throw themselves to the ground instinctively, embracing the frozen surface as if it could protect them. But the ice doesn't block shrapnel. Fragments pierce legs, tear open bellies, rip off arms. The white is stained red, spreading warm blood that steams as it touches the icy surface. Soon after come the artillery fire. Shots fired from the shore hit the ice with cruel precision. Each impact creates long cracks that spread like webs. Some cracks grow too fast, opening up beneath entire groups. There is no time to react. 1 second ago, men were marching. The next, they disappear beneath the water. Panic tries to set in, but running is even more deadly. Those who run concentrate their weight, slip, and fall. Officers shout to keep their distance, to advance slowly, but their voices are lost amidst explosions and wind. Military discipline clashes with the most primitive instinct, survival. Aviation returns in waves. Machine guns sweep across the ice, forcing men to throw themselves to the ground again. Some feign death, covered in snow and blood, waiting for the plane to pass. Others don't have that chance. Those who are hit often don't scream. The shock and the cold rob them even of that. When the attack finally ceases, the silence that remains is even worse. A silence broken only by the distant crack of ice and the low groans of the wounded. Holes multiply along the way, forcing dangerous detours. The column is smaller, always smaller. It is clear to everyone the enemy even reached the ice. The Gulf of Finland is not a refuge. It is an open battlefield where each bomb doesn't just kill men, it destroys the very ground beneath their feet. Even so, the march continues, because stopping means waiting for the next attack. And on the ice, waiting is dying. After the bombings, the ice is never the same again. What was already dangerous has now become even more so. Unstable, injured like a cracked body, threatening to collapse at any moment. The explosions have opened deep fissures, and the extreme cold attempts to close them, creating invisible traps beneath a thin layer of freshly fallen snow. The column advances with even more caution. Each step is tested before being taken. Some men tap the ground with the butt of their rifles, trying to hear the sound of the ice. A hollow sound means danger. But there is not always a warning. Sometimes the ice simply yields without announcement. A dry crack echoes, then another. In seconds, a long crack opens in the middle of the march. Men try to jump back, but the concentrated weight causes the gap to widen. One soldier slips, tries to brace himself on another, and both disappear together into the black water. The impact is so quick that there are no long screams, just a muffled sound, followed by silence. The water of the Gulf of Finland is unforgiving. It steals the air from your lungs on first contact. Muscles lock up. The body panics. Even the best swimmers don't last more than a few seconds. The weight of the equipment pulls you down. Hands emerge for an instant on the surface and disappear. Those watching know they can't help. Getting too close means falling too. Makeshift ropes are thrown hastily, but often it's too late. Eyes avert. No one wants to watch for long. The march must continue. Draft animals also suffer. Horses slip, neigh desperately, break their own legs as they fall. When the ice opens up beneath them, the sound is even more brutal. Some soldiers try to quickly put them down to end their suffering. Others fail. The ice swallows everything in the same way. Each hole left behind becomes a silent landmark. There are no crosses, no names, just patches of dark water slowly freezing like scars along the way. The ice closes again, hiding the bodies below, preserved by the cold, beyond the reach of any proper burial. Fear intensifies. It's no longer just the fear of enemy attack. It's the constant fear of the ground beneath their feet. Men walk tensely, their bodies rigid, as if that could avert the worst. Some murmur prayers, others simply count steps, trying not to think. The ice breaks repeatedly throughout the crossing, and each time the column gets smaller. Not because of desertion, not because of surrender, but because the sea is frozen. Collect your shareman by man, without haste, without pity. Still, no one returns, because returning means facing the enemy. Moving forward means facing the ice. And between two horrors, all that remains is to choose the one that still offers a small chance of living. The march of the wounded. Ah, the wounded. Those staggering specters, the true involuntary martyrs of this glacial odyssey, where each step is not a conquest, but a prolonged agony, a torturous echo of human frailty before the merciless embrace of the Baltic winter. Imagine, if you can, the vast white carpet of the frozen Baltic Sea, stretching like an endless tomb under the leaden sky of January 1945, when Soviet forces, inexorable as a red avalanche, advanced on the eastern Prussian lands, forcing hundreds of thousands into a desperate retreat. It was not a march. It was a funeral procession in slow motion, where the wounded, those who were once robust soldiers or unlucky civilians caught in the crossfire, now dragged themselves along like tormented souls, abandoned by the gods of war and mercy. Consider their suffering, multiplied by the harshness of the environment. A man, say, a young lieutenant in the Wehrmacht, struck by shrapnel from a Soviet grenade during the defense of Königsberg, that once glorious city, now reduced to smoldering ruins under incessant bombardment. His right leg, bandaged with tattered rags from abandoned. Uniforms hardened by blood frozen into dark red crystals, throbbed with a pain that transcended the physical, seeping into the soul like icy poison. Every movement was a symphony of torment, the dragging of his foot, the grinding of his bones, the broken breath escaping his cracked lips, trying to suppress a groan that might betray weakness and thus slow down the entire column. For slowing down meant death, not only for himself but for everyone, exposed to the Soviet fighter planes that swept the skies like hungry falcons, raining down shrapnel and bombs on the defenseless. There was no luxury of motorized ambulances, like those the Western Allies enjoyed on their more civilized fronts. Here, in the frozen heart of East Prussia, transport was barbaric improvisation. Sleds hastily assembled from doors torn from abandoned farms in Pillau or Kranz, loose planks from looted barns, or even broken skis tied together with frayed ropes. Two companions, exhausted themselves, pulled from the front, their muscles burning under the strain, while a third pushed from behind, frozen hands gripping the rough wood. One slip, oh, the terror of a simple slip, and the sled would tip over, throwing the wounded man onto the treacherous ice, where the impact reverberated like a personal earthquake, reopening wounds, spreading fresh blood that instantly froze in grotesque patterns like exposed veins in the snow. The cold, that invisible tyrant, transformed wounds into prolonged, slow, and inexorable executions. Remember the historical facts. During the mass evacuation of January and February 1945, when more than 1 million Germans fled the Red Army, the thermometer plummeted to 20 degrees or less, and the Baltic wind cut like blades. A cut that in milder climates could be sutured and healed here froze superficially, creating an illusory crust of stability, while inside the tissue necrotized, Gangrene stealthily took hold, and septicemia whispered promises of the end. Hypothermia, that silent thief, arrived like an inviting sleep, making the wounded quiet down, their glazed eyes losing focus, their complaints ceasing. "He's calm now," a colleague would say, but deep down dread would set in. Too calm was the harbinger of death, the body betraying itself, shutting down vital organs to conserve energy that no longer existed. Some, the most unfortunate, lost feeling in their extremities. A veteran of the Eastern Front, perhaps a survivor of Stalingrad only to end up here, pleaded in a hoarse voice, "Leave me, comrades. Keep going. I'm dead weight." The words hung in the icy air like breath smoke, laden with abysmal despair, a terror that gnawed at the soul of whoever heard them. Abandon? How? Still, the column pressed on because war allowed no sentimentality. But each abandonment was a psychic wound. Soldiers who, years later, in Soviet prisoner of war camps or in rebuilt homes in divided Germany, would wake up in a cold sweat, reliving the moment they cut the ropes, leaving a brother in arms behind, his eyes pleading not for salvation, but for a quick end. And then came the air raids, those winged demons of the Soviet Air Force, the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, known as flying tanks, swooping down from the sky with a blood-curdling roar. The wounded, immobilized on their sleds, were easy prey, unable to throw themselves to the ground or crawl for non-existent cover. A bomb exploded nearby. The ground trembled, the ice cracked into fissures like broken veins, and the sleds overturned, hurling bodies like broken mannequins. The impact, bones cracking, screams muffled by the wind, blood spraying the snow in red arcs that froze in the air. Some died instantly, a merciful, abrupt end. Others lay there, on their backs, eyes fixed on the grey, indifferent sky, feeling life drain away drop by drop, the terror of utter solitude consuming them as the column, forced to move on, left them behind. Even worse were the cracks in the ice, those treacherous chasms that opened up under the accumulated weight. Historical accounts from survivors of Operation Hannibal, the naval and land evacuation that saved some 1.2 million people but cost tens of thousands of lives, describe moments of primal panic, the ice groaning like a wounded animal, fissures snaking like black lightning bolts across the whiteness, and brutal split-second decisions. "Release the load! Cut the ropes!" an officer shouted, tears freezing on his cheeks as he watched a sled sink, the wounded man on it struggling in the icy black water, his lungs filling with liquid agony. The terror was palpable, the sound of bubbles rising, screams echoing until they fell silent, and the survivors pressing on, haunted by the ghost of what they could have been. The march was slow, uneven, punctuated by forced pauses where the wounded begged for water, which froze in their canteens, or for a moment of rest that seemed endless. Every meter gained was an inhuman triumph, paid for with sweat, that turned to ice on their brows, with breath that burned in their lungs. But they continued, because abandoning all the wounded would be admitting that the retreat had become an inhuman holocaust, a surrender not to the enemy, but to inner barbarity. At twilight, as night descended like a cloak of absolute darkness, the cold intensified, penetrating bones and souls. Many wounded simply did not awaken. Their bodies, rigid as ice statues, covered by a thin layer of snow that transformed them into anonymous monuments to suffering. The column, now smaller, continued onward, each man carrying the invisible weight of fear. If I fall wounded, who will drag me? On the Baltic ice, war grants no second chances. Despair was a constant companion, terror a whisper in the wind, and the march of the wounded a living elegy to human hopelessness. Civilians on the path to death. And among the hardened soldiers, scarred by battles like those of Memel or Riga, where the Red Army crushed entire. Divisions in 1944 walked the innocent, the non-combatants, dragged into the vortex of catastrophe. Civilians, women with faces marked by maternal fatigue, elderly people bent by the weight of decades, children whose innocent eyes had been robbed of their purity by the sight of unspeakable horrors. They did not belong to that icy hell. Their presence was a cosmic error, a cruel irony of history, echoing the great forced migrations of the Second World War, when entire populations of East Prussia and the Baltic countries were displaced by the Soviet advance, resulting in one of the greatest humanitarian tragedies of the conflict, with estimates of up to 500,000 civilians lost in the chaos. For these civilians, the ice of the Gulf of Finland was not a strategic bridge, as it had been for the generals planning the retreat. It was a precarious path, the last tenuous line between life and the abyss, where terror manifested itself in every gust of wind that howled like lost souls. The women, many of them recent widows, husbands fallen in the trenches or executed in Soviet reprisals, carried makeshift bags, tied with frayed woolen threads, a yellowed photograph of a once intact family, a chunk of bread hardened by the cold, rationed as if it were gold, and perhaps a tiny toy, a tattered rag bear whose weight was irrational, but whose abandonment would be a betrayal of what remained of normality. Each of their steps was an act of defiance against despair, their feet wrapped in insufficient rags bleeding against the sharp ice. The children, oh, the poor children, wrapped in thin blankets, stained with soot from the bombed cities. Many had ceased crying, exhausted beyond human limits, their little faces pale as ghosts, their empty eyes reflecting a mute terror that was more terrifying than any scream. Their silence cut deeper than the wind, a silence of premature resignation, of childlike souls who had learned, at 5 or 6 years old, that the world was a place of inescapable pain. Remember the true stories. During the January 1945 escape, thousands of children perished in the ice, victims not of bullets, but of the merciless cold. Their mothers forced to carry them to the end, feeling their little bodies grow cold in their arms. The terror growing like a black tide, the elderly, those guardians of ancient memories, dragged themselves along slowly, their feet dragging furrows in the snow, leaning on makeshift canes made of broken branches or on trembling knees. Each pause was a mortal risk. The body still, lost heat rapidly, fingers blackening with frostbite, hearts weakening under stress. Soldiers, with gestures that mixed gentleness and urgency, a touch on the shoulder, a whispered word, tried to hurry them along. "Move forward, Grandpa, the enemy is coming." But excessive gentleness could be lethal, exposing everyone to danger. The terror lay in the imminence, an elderly person falling, fragile bones breaking on impact, and their spine paralyzed, vulnerable to an air raid that could claim dozens. The ice, that capricious monster, did not forgive inexperience. Civilians, oblivious to the subtle signs, the change in color under the snow, the hollow sound of a thin area, would stumble, and panic would erupt like an explosion. Cries echoed, "Mother, mother!" as a child slipped into a crevasse, the icy water swallowing them in seconds, the thermal shock paralyzing muscles, drowning hope. Mothers threw themselves in, hands outstretched in futile despair, risking the same fate, maternal terror, the worst of all, consuming them entirely. Historical testimonies from survivors describe scenes of horror, entire families disappearing under the ice, bubbles rising like last breaths, and the rest of the column petrified, forced to continue. In rare moments of humanity, soldiers would abandon their rifles to guide civilians through dangerous stretches, extending calloused hands to help a woman with a baby in her arms cross an unstable ice bridge. It was a noble gesture, but costly. Every second standing still invited disaster, a Soviet fighter jet appearing on the horizon, strafing the column, or the ice giving way under the weight. Still, they helped, because the weight of inaction would be unbearable, a ghost that would haunt them on sleepless nights, reliving the pleading faces of the abandoned. The cold struck civilians with redoubled ferocity. Without padded uniforms or lined boots, exposed to the wind that cut like knives, they quickly succumbed. Children fell asleep in their mothers' arms, the sleep of hypothermia disguised as peace. But the mothers knew death was approaching. They shook them with savage despair, tears freezing on their faces, whispering hoarse prayers, "Wake up, my angel, wake up!" The terror was visceral, the despair a bottomless abyss, knowing that a nap could be eternal. When someone fell, an elderly person stumbling, a child slipping, and disappeared beneath the ice, there was no time for ritual mourning. The column marched on, the survivors turning one last time, etching faces into their memories, the dread of never seeing loved ones again gnawing at them. In the Gulf of Finland, war devoured civilians and soldiers alike, but for the civilians, the cruelty was exponential. They fought not for glory or land, but for mere survival, a primal instinct in a world where everything had already perished. The path of death was paved with their shattered hopes, and each step echoed with the silent lament of lost humanity, the invisible fear, the ice that groans. Ah, the groaning ice, that sonic spectre, that subtle harbinger of catastrophe, seeping into bones and minds like a slow poison, transforming the vast white expanse of the Baltic Sea into a stage of psychological terror, where the enemy is not the Soviet soldier with his gleaming bayonet or the bomber roaring in the skies, but the very ground beneath their feet, treacherous and unpredictable. Think of the brutal winter of 1945, when the forces of the Red Army, driven by the fury of vengeance after years of Nazi invasions, swept through East Prussia like a relentless storm, forcing a mass retreat known as the Courland and Prussian evacuation, where hundreds of thousands, exhausted soldiers, terrified civilians, crossed the frozen ice of the Gulf of Finland and the Curonian Lagoon. A fragile blanket of solidified water that, under the pressure of human weight and the merciless climate, began to protest with sounds that echoed like the laments of a dying world. As the endless hours passed, the men, those remnants of once invincible armies, now reduced to trembling shadows in the eternal twilight of the Baltic winter, began to understand, with a dread that took root in the deepest part of their being, that the greatest adversary there did not wear a grey or red uniform, did not wield rifles or grenades, nor did it appear on the misty horizon like an invading horde. No, it resided below, invisible and omnipresent, in the icy heart of the sea they dared to tread. The ice began to groan, not a thunderous roar, but dry cracks like bones breaking in the distance, long, deep creaks that vibrated through the soles of worn boots, rising up numb legs, echoing in their chests like a drum of imminent execution. It was as if the ocean itself, trapped beneath that white crust, was protesting the unbearable burden it carried, the weight of desperate souls, of overloaded sleds, of hopes crushed by war. Each noise, each treacherous whisper of the ice paralyzed the spine for an eternal instant, a hiatus of collective terror where time stretched like a rope about to snap. Gazes crossed in the oppressive silence, pupils dilated by primal fear, reflections of pale faces marked by frost and fatigue. No one needed to verbalize the question that hung in the icy air. What was that? Is it going to break now? Everyone knew instinctively, like animals sensing a trap. Sometimes the sound was mere adjustment, the ice settling under the thermal variations of the agonizing day, a harmless sigh amidst the chaos. Other times, it was the prelude to a catastrophic fracture, a crack that spread like a black lightning bolt under the snow, swallowing everything in its path. The difference? Impossible to predict, a whim of nature that mocked human rationality, leaving men at the mercy of a blind and cruel fate. This fear was unique, unlike anything those soldiers, many veterans, of the Leningrad massacre or the Kursk massacre of 1943, where tanks collided like steel behemoths and the air filled with smoke and screams, had ever experienced. In conventional battle, the danger was external, tangible, a whistling bullet, an explosion illuminating the night sky, an enemy that could be targeted, fought, perhaps even defeated with cunning or bravery. Here, in the vast frozen desert, terror emerged from below, from the hidden abyss, a threat that could not be confronted with weapons or strategies. The ground, that apparent ally in the desperate escape, could transform into a killer at any moment, without fanfare or warning, opening like the jaws of an underwater leviathan to devour the unwary. This corroded the mind like acid, undermining sanity drop by drop. Some men began to hyperventilate, the thin Baltic air burning their lungs, dizziness seizing them like vertigo over an invisible precipice, their balance slipping away like sand between frozen fingers. Panic, that contagious virus, threatened to spread through the spine, and panic on the ice was fatal, leading to chaotic runs that only accelerated the collapse, transforming a fissure into a collective abyss. The order, shouted by hoarse officers whose voices trembled despite their forced authority, was to keep their distance, never walk too close to each other, spread their weight like seeds in the wind, avoid crowds that concentrated pressure on weak points. But the howling wind, laden with fine snow like needles that blinded the eyes and cut exposed skin, and the darkness that deepened like spilled ink, made this a vain illusion. At night, when the sun set early, plunging the world into absolute darkness, punctuated only by the ghostly glimmer of snow, fear multiplied exponentially, a monster that fed on shadows. Flashlights were strictly forbidden. A lone flash could attract the watchful eyes of the Soviet Air Force, the Yakovlev Yak-9 or the dreaded Lavochkin La-5, which patrolled the skies like nocturnal predators, ready to unleash death on any sign of life. Thus, the advance became a blind procession, guided only by the vague silhouette of the man ahead, a human chain of ghosts groping in the void, each step an act of blind faith on a ground that betrayed them. The ice responded to every mistake with sadistic vengeance, a macabre dialogue between man and element. When someone stumbled, perhaps an exhausted civilian carrying a burden of insignificant belongings, or a soldier whose legs weakened after days without rest and fell hard, the impact reverberated like a hammer on glass, followed by a louder, more aggressive crack that echoed like a gunshot in the silence. In certain stretches, where the ice was thinner, a result of warm underwater currents undermining the solidity of the surface, the sound propagated for dozens of meters, a wave of vibration suggesting a crack running stealthily beneath the snow, about to erupt into chaos. In those moments, unmoved, immobility seemed the only refuge, a collective paralysis where hearts beat erratically, breaths were suspended, the absolute terror that any gesture could be the final trigger. To remain motionless, frozen not only by the cold but by dread, was preferable to a desperate escape that would only hasten the disaster. Some soldiers, those warriors broken by the accumulation of horrors, by seeing comrades torn apart in Elbing or drowned in the frozen Vistula, murmured ancient prayers, words in German or Polish or Latvian, invoking gods who seemed deaf to the clamor of humanity. Others talked to themselves, disjointed monologues to anchor their minds in the abyss of madness. Just one more step, Hans. Just one more. There were those who obsessively counted steps, a numerical ritual to impose order on chaos. Those who repeated the names of loved ones, distant wives in bombed Berlin, children left behind in devastated villages, as talismans against despair. Those who simply fixed their eyes on the treacherous ground and advanced mechanically, automatons of flesh and blood, driven by the inertia of survival. The invisible fear did not bleed the body with visible wounds. It bled its soul, draining vitality, sowing seeds of trauma that would flourish in sleepless nights for decades, in veterans who, surviving the war, would succumb to the weight of memories. When, at last, the sound ceased, a silence that fell like an ephemeral blessing, the relief was fleeting, an illusion dispelled by the inescapable knowledge that it would return, inevitable as the tide beneath the ice. The ice never truly stood still. It merely waited, patient and malevolent, building tension for the next groan. And as the column advanced, snaking through the white immensity, man after man internalized a bitter truth. Surviving there depended not only on physical strength, forged in forced marches and bloody battles, nor on courage, that mythical virtue that evaporated before the unknown, but on something infinitely more fragile and capricious, luck, that indifferent goddess who decided who stood on firm ground and who plunged into the icy abyss. The ice continued to groan, a spectral chorus permeating the air, each note a grim reminder that, in that white hell, death could come unseen, unheard beyond a final whisper and without leaving a trace. Bodies swallowed by the sea, souls dissolved in the wind, hopes buried beneath eternal layers of snow. The terror was total, despair an inseparable companion, and the march continued, a testament to broken yet inextinguishable human resilience at the heart of one of history's greatest tragedies. Sacrificed rearguards. As the main column advances across the ice, someone must stay behind, not by choice but out of necessity. Small units receive clear, silent orders, delay the enemy for as long as possible. These are men who know exactly what this means. There will be no organized retreat for them. There will be no second chance. These rearguards are positioned on frozen shores, in the ruins of coastal villages, behind snow-covered dunes, and among abandoned wreckage. With few heavy weapons and limited ammunition, they face a numerous and determined enemy. Every shot is calculated. Every minute gained costs lives. The goal is not to win, but buy time for more men to cross the ice. Time for civilians to move away. Time for the main column to disappear into the white before the Red Army can pursue it directly. Across the frozen surface, the fighting is short and brutal. Gunfire echoes in the wind. Grenades explode, kicking up snow and frozen ground. There are no deep trenches. The hard ground prevents digging. Soldiers fight exposed, often until their last bullet. When ammunition runs out, some destroy their own weapons, so they don't fall into enemy hands. In the distance, those marching on the ice can still hear the muffled sounds of battle, faint explosions, isolated bursts of gunfire. They know what it means. Each sound is a warning that someone is dying, so they can keep walking. No one comments. But the weight of that awareness accompanies every step. For those who remain, the end comes quickly or terribly slowly. Some are killed in direct combat. Others are surrounded. Many choose to fight to the end, not out of fanaticism, but because they know the fate that awaits them if captured, especially for local collaborators, for whom the war does not end with surrender. When silence finally falls in the rear, the main column is already too far away to turn back. The sacrifice has served its purpose. The enemy has been delayed, but the cost was absolute. On the ice, there are no memorials for these men. There are no crosses marking where they fell. They disappear from history almost as silently as they disappeared from the landscape. But without them, many of those who move on, they would never have taken the next step. The march continues, and each survivor carries with them the bitter certainty that they are alive because others were left behind and will never leave again. Total exhaustion. There comes a point where the body it no longer responds as it should. It's not a sudden decline, it's a slow and cruel deterioration. The legs keep walking out of habit, not strength. The feet feel like blocks of wood, heavy, numb. Many men haven't felt their toes for hours, maybe days. They just trust that they're still there. Exhaustion dominates everything. Soldiers march, with half-closed eyes, stumbling over small irregularities in the ice. Some speak nonsense, others laugh to themselves, clear signs that their minds are beginning to fail. The cold, hunger, and lack of sleep combine to create an invisible but devastating enemy. Stopping is almost impossible. When someone falls to their knees, their teammates forcibly lift them up. not out of cruelty, but because they know the truth. Whoever sits on the ice never gets up again. The body cools down too quickly. Tiredness turns to sleep. Sleep turns to death. Many beg for just a few minutes of rest. Few receive it. Some simply collapse as they walk. They don't slip, they don't stumble, they just shut down. Their bodies can't take it anymore. In those moments there's no drama. One man falls, the others move aside, and the column continues. Sometimes someone pulls the body out of the way. Sometimes not even that. The ice takes care of the rest. Hunger corrodes their last remaining strength. Rations ran out long ago. What remains are hard, frozen pieces that can barely be chewed. Eating hurts, swallowing hurts, but not eating hurts even more. Some men have been walking for days with almost no food, sustained only by the will to reach the other shore. At night, exhaustion is even more dangerous. The darkness blurs distances. The wind seems stronger. The ice seems thinner. Many fight the urge to close their eyes as they walk. Some lose that fight by a second, and that second is enough. The column is different now, smaller, slower, quieter. Hardly anyone talks. There's no energy for words. Each man is trapped inside his own head, waging a private battle against a body that wants to give up. Total exhaustion doesn't explode like a bomb. It deletes people one by one, silently. And as the ice continues to stretch ahead, everyone knows they haven't reached the end yet. They know they need to find strength that no longer exists, because in the Gulf of Finland, surviving means continuing to walk. When everything inside you is begging you to stop, the land in sight. After an eternity of white and silence, something changes on the horizon. At first, it's just a dark shadow, almost imperceptible, mistaken for low clouds or yet another illusion created by exhaustion. Many blink, thinking they're imagining things, but little by little the shape becomes clear. Land, firm ground, the other side. The news spreads through the column in hoarse whispers. No one shouts. There is no celebration. Hope arrives too weary to explode. Even so, it exists, fragile but real. Some men feel their legs tremble, not from cold, but from restrained relief. Others weep silently, tears freezing on their faces before falling. But land in sight doesn't mean immediate salvation. The last few kilometers are the most dangerous. The ice near the coast is treacherous, weakened by currents and temperature variations. Many believe they have already won, and it is precisely there that the sea once again exacts its price. Cracks appear near the end, as if the ice refuses to release its prey so easily. Soviet attacks continue. Planes reappear, attempting to strike the column before it reaches shelter. Artillery fires at the last groups on the ice. Men fall just meters from safety, dead when they could already smell the earth, the wood, the smoke. Those who reach the shore do not fall to their knees in victory. They collapse. Many are unable to stand. Hands touch the ground as if needing to confirm that this is real. Some kiss the frozen earth, others simply stand motionless, looking back at the path they have just crossed, a path dotted with holes, dark patches, and silence. The wounded are left on the ground, finally out of the ice. Civilians embrace, count children, discover who was left behind. There are brief reunions, but also definitive absences. Names are called and not answered. Gazes search for faces that will never appear again. The journey isn't over for everyone, but for many, that moment marks the end of their worst nightmare. They escape the ice. They haven't won the war. They aren't safe yet, but they survived. White hell of the Gulf of Finland. And while the last men still struggle to break free from the ice, one truth is evident to all who have reached dry land. They will never be the same again. The frozen sea will remain with them forever, in their dreams, in their silence, and in the memories of those who managed to return to tell this story. The price of survival, reaching. Dry land does not mean peace. For many, it is merely the beginning of another battle. The battle to continue living after what has been seen and felt. The survivors are scattered along the coast like human shadows, covered in ice, dried blood, and utter exhaustion. Doctors do what they can, but there's a shortage of medicine, stretchers, and hands. The war offers no rest, not even to those who escaped hell. Bodies begin to reveal the true extent of the damage. Feet blackened by necrosis, toes that need to be amputated without anesthesia, wounds that became infected during the march. Men who walked for days now scream in pain as warmth slowly returns to their bodies, a pain as intense as the cold that kept them alive. But the greatest price is not just on the body, it's in the eyes. Many survivors cannot speak. They stare into the void, reliving the sound of the ice breaking, the short cries, the hands disappearing under the water. At night, those who manage to sleep wake with a start. Convinced that they are still on the frozen sea, civilians discover the cruelest burden of all, the count of those who didn't arrive. Broken families, orphaned children, mothers who cross the ice with a child in their arms and arrive with empty arms. There are no ceremonies, no funerals, only silence and guilt for being alive when so many were left behind. Among the soldiers, a bitter truth emerges. They survived not through bravery, but through a cruel combination of resilience and luck. Every step taken on the ice was an invisible gamble, and this awareness gnaws at them. Many wonder why they made it through and others didn't. There is no answer that brings relief. The command is trying to reorganize units, but the men are no longer the same. Discipline exists, but the soul is wounded. The Gulf of Finland was not merely crossed, it was recorded inside them. Every crack of ice, every distant explosion, every silence that lasts too long now lives on in memory. Survival came at too high a price to be celebrated, because those who escaped know a part of them remained forever under the ice, trapped in that frozen sea, along with the bodies and names that will never again be spoken aloud. The crossing is over, but the nightmare, for many, it never truly ends. The legacy of the Baltic Ice Nightmare. When silence finally replaces the sound of boots on ice, what remains is not victory, nor military glory. What remains is a story marked by survival at the limits of human endurance. The crossing of the Gulf of Finland goes down in the memory of the war, not as a brilliant maneuver, but as a brutal reminder of what happens when an army is cornered by history, the enemy, and nature all at once. For those who lived through it, winter is never just winter again. Ice is never just ice again. Every frozen lake, every crackle on cold nights, every biting wind awakens memories that will never fade. Many veterans spend the rest of their lives avoiding talking about the crossing. Others try to tell their stories, but words fail them. How can one explain the sound of a man disappearing beneath their feet? How can one describe the feeling of choosing to move forward while someone dies behind them? Historically, the episode symbolizes the definitive collapse of German dominance in the Baltic. Army Group North ceases to be an offensive force and begins to fight only to avoid disappearing. The retreat across the ice shows the world that the war was already decided. All that remained was who would survive the end. The Gulf of Finland becomes an invisible cemetery. Beneath those cold waters lie soldiers and civilians of different ages, languages, and destinies, preserved by the cold, forgotten by maps. There are no tombstones, no exact dates, not enough official tributes to mark each life lost there. And yet this icy nightmare carries a powerful truth. Even in the most inhumane conditions imaginable, people kept walking. They kept pulling the wounded, holding children, helping strangers. War showed its worst face, but it also revealed the desperate resilience of humankind when all seems lost. The Baltic Ice Nightmare. It's not just a story of retreat, it's the story of men and women walking on death to escape it. A story where the enemy wasn't just the Red Army, but the cold, the ice, the fear, and the very limits of body and mind. And while the ice of the Gulf of Finland melts and reforms each winter, it silently holds the echo of those footsteps, the footsteps of people who crossed the white hell to prove that sometimes simply surviving is the most heroic act of all. When the crossing of the Gulf of Finland ends, the war continues on other maps, with other battles, other numbers, and other statistics. But for those who were there, time stops that winter. Nothing that comes after can erase what was experienced on that frozen sea. The ice was not just a backdrop, it was a relentless judge, deciding who would live and who would remain forever below the surface. The retreat across the Baltic ice reveals the true face of war when all strategy fails. There are no brilliant maneuvers, no tactical victories, no heroic speeches. There are only human beings pushed to their absolute limits, forced to choose between two horrors, the advancing enemy or unforgiving nature. And in this cruel dilemma, every step becomes an act of resistance. Historically, this episode symbolizes the final collapse of the German presence in Northern Europe. The Soviet advance not only defeated armies, it pushed men, women, and children into a flight that should never have existed. The crossing of the ice makes it clear that, at that point in the war, the fight was no longer for victory, but for survival. The Reich had already lost. What was being decided there was who could live to see the end. What is most disturbing is realizing that many of the dead did not fall under enemy fire. They were overcome by cold, hunger, exhaustion, and ice that broke apart without warning. Silent, quick deaths without witnesses. The Gulf of Finland has become an invisible cemetery where thousands disappeared without names, without graves, without farewells. And yet, amidst this absolute horror, gestures emerge that resist being forgotten. Soldiers pulling the wounded to their very limits. Civilians protecting children with their own bodies. Men who could have run alone, but chose to stay and help. These acts don't win the war, but they save humanity amidst total collapse. The Baltic Ice Nightmare reminds us that World War II wasn't just about great battles and famous generals. It was made up of moments like this, where history unfolds far from the cameras, far from textbooks, in places where the suffering is so extreme it seems unbelievable. While the ice in the Gulf of Finland continues to form and melt each winter, it silently preserves the marks of that crossing, and it is up to us to remember. Because forgetting this episode does not erase the pain. It only buries, a second time, those who never managed to leave the ice. This is not just a war story. It's a story about how far can a human being go to stay alive.